They called her the cook. She fed them. She cleaned up after them. She stayed quiet while they talked over her head about cattle prices and fence lines and all the things they believed only men could understand. But on the morning the sky turned the color of a bruise and the horses refused to eat, she was the only one on Blackstone Ranch who knew what was coming. And she had exactly 6 hours to save 37 lives before the worst blizzard in a decade buried them all alive. Stay with me until the very end, because this story is going to shake you. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and become part of our family. You will not want to miss what comes next. And drop a like. Then tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The first thing Eliza Rowan did every morning at Blackstone Ranch was check the horses. Not because it was her job. Nobody had asked her to. Her job was the kitchen. Fire by 4:30, coffee before 5, biscuits in the oven before any man swung his boots off his bunk. That was the arrangement. That was what Gideon Mercer paid her for, and she knew better than to pretend it was anything else. But she checked the horses anyway. She would slip out through the back of the cookhouse in the gray dark before sunrise, her coat pulled tight, her breath a small cloud dissolving into the cold Montana air, and she would lean against the top rail of the paddock fence and just watch. Not doing anything in particular, just watching. The other ranch hands thought she was odd for it. She'd overheard Pete Dalloway tell the new boy, Cody, that the widow woman had loose screws, said it low and mean the way cowards always say things. Sideways, behind someone's back, loud enough to be heard. Eliza had not responded. She rarely did. She'd learned a long time ago that explaining yourself to people who had already decided what you were was a waste of breath that could be spent on something useful. It was the second week of November when the thing she'd been watching for finally arrived. She stepped out of the cookhouse that morning and the cold hit her differently. Not sharper, deeper. The kind of cold that doesn't just sting the skin, it presses against your chest like a hand. She stood still for a moment and breathed it in, reading it the way her father had taught her to read weather when she was 7 years old, standing in a potato field in eastern Wyoming while a thunderhead climbed the sky like something alive. Pay attention, he'd told her. The land always tells you first. People just stopped listening. She looked at the sky, low and gray and wrongly colored, not the pale silver of regular overcast, but something greenish, something that felt heavy even to look at. The clouds weren't moving the way clouds usually moved. They were sitting, building. She looked at the horses. Chester, the big roan who usually paced the fence rail at feeding time and nickered loud enough to wake the bunkhouse, was standing perfectly still in the center of the paddock. His ears were flat. His head was low. 2 of the mares had pressed themselves into the far corner of the fence, shoulder to shoulder, not grazing, not moving, just standing together like they were bracing for something. Animals always knew before people did. That was the other thing her father had told her. Eliza stood at that fence for 3 full minutes, doing the math in her head, feeling the pressure in the air, watching the stillness settle over the valley like a held breath. Then she went back inside and started making extra biscuits. Gideon Mercer left for town before 7. He was a tall, spare man in his mid-40s, more bone than flesh, with a permanent squint from years of reading the horizon and a manner of speaking that was so economical it could make people think he was slow. He was not slow. He was simply a man who had no interest in using words he didn't need. He came through the kitchen on his way out, the way he always did, and poured himself a cup of coffee without asking. That was also part of the arrangement. She cooked. He drank whatever he wanted. The ranch was his. "Weather looks agreeable enough," he said, not really to her, more to the window. "Should make it back by supper." Eliza opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at the stiffness in his jaw, the distracted way his eyes were already on the road ahead, already in town, already 3 conversations past this kitchen. She thought about what she would sound like saying what she was thinking. The sky is wrong. The horses are scared. Don't go. In this kitchen, in this apron, to this man who had hired her to cook biscuits. "I'll keep supper warm," she said. Gideon set the cup down and walked out. She watched the wagon roll down the main track until the dust swallowed it. Then she turned back to her stove and made a decision that had nothing to do with biscuits. Sauce. By 8 o'clock, she had walked the entire north pasture. This was not the first time. She had been at Blackstone Ranch for 8 months. She'd come in the spring, after her husband Thomas died of a fever that the doctor in Billings had not taken seriously enough until it was far too late, leaving her with a name that meant nothing and no property that had ever been in it. She'd found the job through a woman at a church in town who said the Mercer Ranch was decent, and the pay was reliable, and the work wouldn't kill you. She had taken it without letting herself think too hard about what it meant to spend her days cooking for men who would never learn her last name. But she had not spent those 8 months only in the kitchen. She walked in the mornings and in the evenings when her work was done. She walked because she was restless, and because she had always been restless, and because sitting still had never agreed with her. She walked the pastures and the creek lines and the rocky upper ground where the fence posts tilted from the freeze and thaw, and she walked the canyon cuts and the timber breaks along the northern ridge. She walked until she knew this land the way she had once known the land around her father's farm. Not as a map, but as a feeling, an instinct, the knowledge that lives in your feet and in your gut. She knew where the north wind hit hardest. She knew which hollow flooded and which didn't. She knew the canyon on the western edge of the property, a natural bowl cut into the hillside by some ancient water long since dried up, that sat below the tree line and out of the direct line of the northern gales. She had stood in that canyon last March when a cold snap came through, and she'd noticed how the temperature there was a full 10 degrees warmer than the open pasture, how the walls broke the wind completely. She had filed that observation in the back of her mind the way she filed everything, in a place nobody else could see. Now she needed it. She found Silas Boone repairing a fence section near the creek at 8:30. Silas was the oldest hand on the property, somewhere between 55 and 60, depending on which story he was telling, with a face like cured leather and hands so calloused they looked like a different material than skin. He had worked cattle ranches in Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado. He had been through 2 bad winters and 1 catastrophic flood and a prairie fire that had taken a ranch he'd poured 12 years into. He was, in Eliza's private assessment, the only man on this property who had earned the right to be confident about anything. "Silas," she said. He looked up from the wire. "Mrs. Rowan, I need you to listen to me for a minute." Something in her voice made him set the pliers down. She told him what she'd seen. The horses, the sky, the pressure in the air, the stillness that had rolled across the valley since before dawn, the way sound was traveling differently this morning, too flat, too close, like the world was already muffling itself. She told him about the temperature reading she'd taken off the porch thermometer and how it had dropped 6 degrees in 2 hours, not slowly but in lurches, the way temperature drops when something serious is building fast. She told him she thought they had 6 hours, maybe 7, if they were lucky. Silas didn't say anything for a long moment. He looked at the sky. He looked at the creek, which was running quieter than usual. He looked back at Eliza. "How bad?" he said. "Bad enough that the herd needs to be in that western canyon before noon." He picked his teeth with a thumbnail, thinking. "Gideon's in town," he said. "I know. Boys aren't going to like taking orders from—" He paused, chose his words. "From someone outside the regular chain." "I know that too." He looked at her steadily for another moment. There was something happening behind his eyes, some calculation being made. She held his gaze and didn't fidget, didn't soften her expression, didn't do the thing women in her position were expected to do, which was to look apologetic for taking up space. "You been wrong before?" he asked. "About weather?" She thought about it honestly. "Once, 1903. Cost my father a half day of field work. Nothing serious." Silas picked up his pliers and coiled the loose wire around his fist and stood up. "Let's go talk to the boys," he said. Well, the boys did not want to be talked to. There were 8 of them at the ranch that week. Pete Dalloway and his younger brother Vin, the new kid Cody, who had been hired in September and was still trying to establish himself, a quiet Swede named Anders who spoke maybe 4 words a day, and 4 other men whose names Eliza had learned precisely because she had made a point of learning them, because she had understood from her first week that knowing people's names was a form of power that cost you nothing. Pete Dalloway was the problem. He was 32, Not particularly skilled at his job, but loud about his opinions. The kind of man who confused volume with authority. He had made his feelings about Eliza clear within her first week on the ranch. Not cruelly, not even consciously, just through the particular way he talked over her when she was present, through the requests he addressed to Silas even when Eliza was standing closer, through the way he called her the cook even after he knew her name. When Silas gathered the men in the yard and explained the situation, left it plain and simple, no editorializing, said that Mrs. Rowan believed a serious blizzard was 6 hours out and they needed to move the herd to the western canyon and reinforce the structures before it hit, Pete was the first one to speak. "She's the cook," he said. "Not she might be wrong. Not what's her reasoning. Just, she's the cook." As if that answered everything. Eliza stood at the edge of the group, arms folded against the cold, and kept her expression neutral. "She's been right about every weather shift since March," Silas said. "I've been watching. The woman pays attention." "She makes biscuits," Pete said, and Vin snickered next to him. Eliza let one full second pass. Then she spoke, not loudly, just clearly. "Look at your horses," she said. A few of the men looked toward the paddock. "Not quickly," she said. "Look at them the way you look at something you want to understand. Tell me what you see." The yard went quiet. Even Pete turned and looked. Chester was still standing motionless in the center of the paddock, head low, ears back. The two mares were still pressed into their corner. The other horses had clustered near the shelter wall without being driven there, standing close together, almost touching. "They haven't eaten this morning," Eliza said. "Not a one of them. I checked the feed. Full bin, untouched." She looked at each man in turn. "Horses that won't eat in November are telling you something. You can argue with me all you want. You can't argue with that." Nobody said anything. Even Pete Dalloway was looking at the horses with a different expression now. Young Cody raised his hand slightly, like a schoolboy. "What do you need us to do?" She put them to work with the kind of clarity that comes from having planned something out in your head across 8 months of quiet mornings. Silas and 3 of the hands would move the herd, all 140 cattle, from the north pasture to the western canyon. She had sketched the route on a piece of paper, showing the gap in the fence line she'd already identified as the easiest passage, showing where the terrain sloped and where the herd would naturally want to drift and how to counter that drift. Silas looked at the sketch for about 10 seconds, nodded once, and took it. 2 men would reinforce the barn, new timber bracing on the north-facing wall, which she had been watching flex in ordinary winds for months, and the rear doors needed the crossbar replaced because the current one had cracked and was being held by a single rusted nail. She told them which timber was already cut and stored near the equipment shed. 1 man would haul water. Every barrel they had, filled and stored inside the main house, and the cookhouse, and the barn. She told him to fill the largest cooking pot and leave it simmering on the stove so it wouldn't freeze. Pete Dalloway she assigned to collecting firewood, not because it was the easiest job, but because she needed someone working alone where his mouth couldn't slow everyone else down. He looked at her when she told him. "You serious?" he said. 2 cords, she said, stacked inside, not outside. "And bring the splitting maul in too. You might need to split inside if it gets bad enough." "You're not even supposed to," he started. "Pete." Silas's voice was quiet and flat as a stone dropped on flat ground. "Go get the wood." Pete went. Eliza turned back to her list. By 11 o'clock, the sky had changed. It was no longer the greenish-gray of morning. It had gone a deep, bruised purple-black to the north, the kind of sky that looked almost artificial, like a painting that had been made too dramatic to be believed. The wind had started, not hard yet, but steady, and it had a sound underneath it, a low, grinding pressure that Eliza felt more in her chest than her ears. She moved between stations constantly, checking, correcting, helping where she could. She helped Anders carry a water barrel that was too heavy for 1 person. She climbed the barn ladder herself to check Cody's work on the north brace and added 2 more nails where the wood hadn't fully caught. She went to the cookhouse and began preparing food that could be eaten cold if the fire went out. Smoked meat, dried beans already soaked and simmered, hardtack, the full wheel of cheese she'd been saving. She was not graceful about any of it. She dropped a jar of molasses, getting it off a high shelf, and cut her palm on the broken glass and wrapped it with a strip of dish towel and kept moving. Her hair kept escaping its pins, and she kept pushing it back with the heel of her hand. At one point, she caught herself snapping at Cody when he asked a question at the wrong moment, and she stopped and took a breath and said, "Sorry, you're fine. Here's the answer." She was tired. She was not calm the way the story might later be told. The way people always smooth things over in retrospect made the hero serene, made the crisis clean. Inside her chest there was a steady drumbeat of urgency that she was keeping caged by sheer will, because she knew that the moment she let it out into her face or her voice, the men around her would feel it, and a rattled crew was slower than a calm one. So she caged it and kept moving. By 1 in the afternoon, the herd was in the western canyon. Silas came back across the frozen ground with the hands behind him, their faces reddened by the wind that was now coming in genuine gusts, and he walked straight to Eliza where she was standing in the yard with her list. "Done," he said. "Kenyon's got plenty of dry ground at the back, out of the wind. They settled fast." "Good." She checked it off. "Barn?" "Braced. Doors secured." "Water?" "Inside." She looked at the list again, thought through the ranch's layout in her head, room by room, structure by structure. Thought about the north pasture fence. A section of it was down and the posts weren't worth the nails holding them, but without cattle in the pasture it didn't matter right now. Thought about the equipment shed, whether the doors would hold, decided they probably would. "Get everyone in the main house," she said. "Bring your bedrolls, bring your coats and every spare layer you own. I want everyone under one roof before 3 o'clock. Silas nodded, started to turn. "Silas." He stopped. "Thank you," she said. Just that, simple and straight. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then he said, "You've been watching this ranch since March, and none of us knew it." "Somebody needed to," she said. He nodded once more and walked away to gather the men. Eliza looked north, at the sky that was now moving fast and dark and full of a pressure that made the air feel like a held fist. The first real gust hit her then, hard enough to stagger her half a step, and she felt the temperature fall in real time, felt it drop off a cliff in the space of a single breath. She pulled her coat tighter and walked back toward the main house. Whatever was coming, it was coming now. And Blackstone Ranch, for the first time and maybe ever, was as ready as it was going to get. The wind found every gap. That was the thing about old buildings. They looked solid from the outside, all that timber and stone giving the impression of permanence. But when a real wind came, it revealed every crack, every poorly fitted joint, every place where the years had shrunk the wood and left a channel for the cold to push through. Eliza could feel it from inside the main house, that insistent probing, the way the gusts tested each wall and came back harder where they found weakness. She was at the kitchen stove when the first of the men began filing in, dragging their bedrolls and their gear, and tracking mud across the floorboards she would probably never fully get clean again. She didn't care about the floor. She cared about the head count. She counted them as they came through the door. Cody first, then Anders with his characteristic silence, then two of the other hands, Marsh and Delbert, who came in together and stood near the wall looking uncertain, the way men always looked when they were in a domestic space they didn't know the rules of. She counted 6, 7, waited. Silas came in last, pulling the door shut behind him against a gust that made the frame shudder. "Where's Pete?" Eliza said. Silas's expression told her before he opened his mouth. "Still at the woodpile. Said he wasn't done." "He's done." She was already moving toward the door. Silas put a hand out, not grabbing her, just placing it in the air between her and the exit. "I'll go." "You just came in from the cold." "So did everyone else. Go tend the stove, Mrs. Rowan. I'll get him." "But shit. Merci." There was something in the way he said it that wasn't condescending exactly. More like he understood that sending her out after Pete would make things worse in ways that had nothing to do with the storm. She recognized the political logic of it and hated that it was correct. She stepped back from the door. Silas went back out. She went back to the stove. The wind hit the north wall hard enough that two of the men flinched visibly. The lamp above the table swayed. Outside, the sound had changed from a roar to something that fluctuated. rising and dropping and rising again, rhythmic in a way that felt almost deliberate, like something breathing. Cody was sitting on his bedroll against the far wall, his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim in a nervous circle. He was 20, maybe 21, with a raw-boned face that hadn't finished deciding what it was going to look like yet. He'd been good today. Hadn't complained, hadn't questioned, had just done what she'd asked with a kind of direct efficiency that she'd noticed and filed away. "How long do you think it'll last?" he asked, not asking anyone in particular, but he was looking at her. "Can't say exactly," she said. She was ladling bean soup into bowls, working steadily, keeping her hands busy because it helped. These systems that come from the north like this, sometimes 12 hours, sometimes 2 days. No way to know until it plays out. 2 days, Marsh repeated from the wall, like the words tasted bad. "We've got food and wood and water and walls," Eliza said. 2 days is inconvenient. It's not a crisis." "Easy for you to say," Marsh muttered. He wasn't being cruel about it, just anxious, the kind of man whose worry came out sideways as complaint. "You've been cooking all day while we've been out in—" "Marsh." Delbert next to him said it quietly, just his name. Marsh shut up. Eliza set a bowl of soup on the table, then another, then another. She didn't acknowledge what Marsh had said, not because she was letting it go, but because she understood that this was not the moment for that conversation. There would be hours ahead, long hours, and tensions tended to surface during them the way rocks surfaced in a field after a rain. Things that were always there, just hidden until conditions changed. The door opened, and Silas came back in with Pete Dalloway, a step behind him. Pete had 2 armloads of split wood, and he dropped them inside the door with a crash that was slightly more forceful than necessary. His jaw was set, and his face was red from the cold and something else. He didn't look at Eliza. He crossed the room, dropped his coat on a hook, sat down heavily in the chair farthest from where she was standing. Eliza put a bowl of soup in front of him. He looked at it, looked away. Then, after a moment, picked up the spoon. She took that as progress. Silas settled into the chair across from Pete, and for a few minutes the only sounds in the room were the wind against the walls and the scrape of spoons on bowls and the occasional hard crack from outside where something, a loose board, a shutter, a branch from the timber line, was catching the full force of what was building out there. "Temperature's going to keep dropping," Eliza said, mostly to herself, looking at the thermometer she'd hung near the kitchen window. It read 19 degrees. 2 hours ago, it had read 31. "I want that fire built up before dark. Real built up, not just coals." "I can do that," Cody said. "Thank you." She meant it. "And someone needs to check the barn at some point tonight. Not in the thick of it, but if there's a quiet spell, just to make sure the bracing held." "I'll go," Anders said. It was more words than he'd spoken all day. Everyone looked at him slightly. He shrugged, apparently unbothered by the attention. "Good." Eliza started collecting the empty bowls. Her hand ached where she'd cut it on the jar. She'd replaced the dish towel with a proper wrapping, but it had soaked through again, and she'd wrapped it a second time and tried not to use that hand more than necessary, which was not easy when you were serving 8 men and tending a stove. "There's more if anyone's hungry. We've got plenty." "You made all this today?" Cody asked, gesturing at the food. "The soup, the bread she'd baked this morning, the cold cuts laid out on the board. Started before 6, she said. "You knew this morning," he said. It wasn't a question exactly, more like he was working something out. "I had a strong feeling this morning," she said, being precise about it. "It got stronger as the day went on." "And you never said anything when Gideon left?" She paused with a stack of bowls in her hands, considered how much honesty the moment called for. "I thought about it," she said. "Why didn't you?" She looked at Cody directly for a moment. He was watching her with genuine curiosity, not the testing kind, not the kind that was looking for a gap to push through. "Just curious." "Because I know how it sounds," she said. "Woman in a kitchen telling a man not to leave for town because the horses look nervous. I made a calculation about how that conversation was going to go." She paused. "Maybe the wrong one. But I made it." The room was quiet except for the wind. Pete Dalloway was staring at the table. She couldn't read his expression and didn't try. Silas refilled his own coffee cup and said, "You turned out to be right." "I've been right before," she said. "Doesn't make the calculation easier the next time." She went back to the stove and nobody said anything else about it for a while. The storm outside, however, had opinions about silence. It screamed them through every crack it could find. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, though afternoon seemed like the wrong word for how dark it had gotten, the blizzard was fully present, not approaching anymore. There. The kind of weather that stops being weather and starts being a condition of existence. A new fact about the world that you simply had to accommodate because it wasn't going anywhere. The temperature outside had dropped to 8 degrees. Eliza knew this because Cody had cracked the door to check the outside thermometer and reported back with a face that said the number had surprised him, even though it shouldn't have. Inside, the fire was roaring and the room was warm but unevenly. Warm near the hearth, cooler along the outer walls, and with a persistent cold draft along the floor that no amount of banked fire could fully address. Eliza had pulled every rug in the house and laid them along the base of the north wall to cut the draft. She'd stuffed rags into 2 window frames where the cold was coming through most insistently. Neither fix was elegant. Both helped. The men had settled into the long, uncomfortable rhythm of waiting. Marsh had produced a deck of cards from somewhere, and he and Delbert were playing at the table with 2 of the other hands. Anders was asleep against the wall with the straightforward practicality of a man who understood that sleep was a resource. Cody had found a book on Gideon's shelf and was reading it by the firelight, though he kept losing his place and staring at the wall with the listening expression of someone who couldn't stop tracking the sound outside. Pete sat by himself near the east window, not doing much of anything. Silas had pulled a chair next to Eliza near the stove, and they were talking in the low, practical tones of 2 people with enough shared context to communicate efficiently. "That north fence section, the one near the creek bend," Silas said. "Few posts have been loose since September. I keep meaning to bring it up with Gideon, but there's always something else." "I've seen it," Eliza said. "Snow load will probably finish off 2 of those posts tonight. Nothing to be done about it now, but it'll need to be one of the first things after the thaw. I'll make a note." He paused. "You make a lot of notes, don't you?" "In my head," she said. "Don't have a notebook." He turned his cup in his hands. "You should have one. Some of what you know about this place ought to be written down." She glanced at him. "Is that your way of saying it shouldn't live only in my head?" "It's my way of saying it's valuable," he said, "and valuable things should be kept somewhere they don't disappear." She understood the weight of what he was saying, that her knowledge of this place, of every fence line and every weather pattern and every structural weakness she'd cataloged over 8 months of quiet observation, could disappear from this ranch along with her if Gideon Mercer decided one day that he'd rather pay less for a cook who just cooked. She looked back at the stove. "We'll see how tonight goes first," she said. A massive gust hit the building then. Not the largest of the day, but one of the more sustained ones. A long, shuddering pressure that made the fire dip in the hearth and the lamp flicker and caused every man in the room to look up from what he was doing. The sound it made against the north wall was like something being dragged over the roof, a grinding scrape that lasted 3 or 4 seconds before the gust eased. In the silence after it, Pete Dalloway spoke from his corner. "How'd you know?" he said. He said it to the window, not turning around. "About the canyon. I've been on this ranch 3 years. Never thought of that canyon for shelter." Eliza looked at the back of his head. She thought about several different ways to answer and discarded most of them. "I walked it," she said simply. "Last March when that cold snap came through. Stood in there and felt the difference." She paused. "You ride through land differently than you walk it. When you're on a horse, you're looking at the distance. When you're on foot, you notice what's close." Pete was quiet for a moment. 3 years, he said again, not quite to himself. She didn't pile on to it, didn't need to. Cody looked up from his book. "Is the herd going to be all right in there? I keep thinking about them." "They'll be cold, but they'll be alive," she said. "That canyon breaks the wind, and the north wall of it holds heat better than open ground. They've got each other's warmth, and there's enough dry ground at the back for them to shelter. It's not comfortable, but comfortable isn't the standard right now." "What is the standard right now?" She thought about it for a second. Living through it, she said. He nodded and went back to his book. The evening wore itself out in the slow way that evenings do when everyone is trapped in the same space with nothing to do but wait and listen. Eliza cooked again at 5. Not a full meal, just heated up beans and the remaining bread and the smoked meat she'd prepared. And the act of eating seemed to settle something in the room, the way shared food usually does. Marsh put the cards away. The low-level snapping tension that had been circulating since Pete came in from the woodpile gradually diffused into something more like mutual exhaustion. Eliza sat down for the first time at 6 o'clock. Just sat. In the chair near the stove that Silas had vacated when he went to relieve Anders on a barn check. Anders had come back at dusk with frost on his eyebrows and reported that the bracing had held, and the animals inside were unsettled but secure, which was all anyone could ask. She unwrapped her hand and looked at the cut. It wasn't deep enough to be serious, but it had opened up again at some point during the evening, and her palm was stiff and sore. She rewrapped it with a clean strip of cloth, pulling the knot tight with her teeth. Cody noticed. He got up without saying anything and came over and held the ends of the bandage while she tied it properly. Neither of them made anything of it. "You should sleep," he said. "I will," she said. "You've been going since before 4 this morning. So have most of you. We weren't also doing all the cooking." He sat back down. "I mean it. We can watch the fire. We can wake you if anything changes." She looked around the room. Marsh and Delbert were already stretched out on their bedrolls. The other 2 hands were propped against the wall with their eyes closed. Anders had gone back to sleep with the focused commitment of a man treating rest as a task to be completed efficiently. Pete was still in his corner, but his head had dropped forward. "Half an hour," she said. "Sure," Cody said, in the tone of a person who understood that she meant considerably more than half an hour and was fine with it. She leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes. The wind outside was constant now, a presence as steady as a river current, something you stopped hearing individually and started hearing as a backdrop to everything else. Underneath it, the fire snapped and settled. The house groaned once, a deep articulation of its own stress, and then was quiet. She did not sleep exactly. She drifted, the way you do when your body is exhausted, but some part of your mind is still on duty, still listening, still tracking. She heard Silas come back in from outside and stomp the snow off his boots. Heard him say something low to Cody that she didn't catch. Heard the fire being built up again, the careful addition of logs, the momentary rush of oxygen. She thought about the herd in the canyon. She thought about the north fence posts. She thought about the barn brace and whether 2 additional nails had been enough or whether she should have added a 3rd before the storm hit. She thought about Gideon Mercer, somewhere between here and town on a night like this, and felt a cold worry entirely separate from the weather. At some point the storm shifted, not lessened but changed its angle, coming now from slightly northwest instead of due north, and the effect on the building was different, a new set of walls taking the brunt of it. Eliza opened her eyes in the firelit room and did her inventory automatically. Head count, fire, sound of the storm, temperature of the room. Everyone was present. The fire was solid. The storm was still out there, enormous and indifferent, doing what it was doing with no concern for the people huddled against it. But the walls were holding. Every wall she had been watching for 8 months. Every weakness she had noted and braced and worried over. They were holding. Not perfectly. The north wall still admitted cold along the floor, and the window in the east bedroom was rattling badly enough that someone had stuffed a wadded coat against the frame. But holding. She let out a long, slow breath. Silas was awake across the room, sitting with his coffee in the dark, the way old men sit when sleep is more a suggestion than a habit. He caught her eye. "Still with us," he said quietly. "Still with us," she agreed. From somewhere out in the dark and the screaming cold, a sound reached them. Sharp, irregular, there and then gone. Both of them went still, listening. It came again, or something like it. Eliza stood up. "That's a horse," she said. Silas was already on his feet. "Or it's aboard somewhere." "It's a horse," she said again, flat and certain. "That's not a structure sound. That's a living thing." They stood in the firelit room and listened to the storm rage outside, trying to pull one specific sound out of all that noise, and Eliza's hand was already moving toward her coat on the hook by the door, even as part of her recognized that going outside right now would be one of the more genuinely dangerous things she'd done in a life that had not been short on difficult decisions. Then the sound stopped. They waited. 30 seconds. A minute. Nothing but wind. Silas looked at her. She looked at the door, looked at the thermometer outside the window, which read 4 degrees, which meant that going outside was not a casual errand. It was a calculated risk with real consequences. "Morning," Silas said. Not a question, a suggestion. She thought about the herd in the canyon, thought about the likelihood that what she'd heard was structural versus animal, thought about what she'd be able to see or do in 4-degree darkness in the middle of a blizzard. "Morning," she said, and took her hand off the coat. She sat back down. Silas sat back down. The fire burned and the wind roared and the house held itself together around the people inside it, imperfect and drafty and, for now, enough. Outside, the storm was not done. It had hours left in it yet, and it wasn't the kind of thing that cared about the plans or the preparations or the quiet stubbornness of one woman who had spent 8 months learning how to keep it from taking everything. But it hadn't taken anything yet, and in the dark and the cold and the long, hard middle of that night, that was the only thing that mattered. The sound came back at 2 a.m. Not the horse sound, something different, a rhythmic pounding, irregular, coming from the direction of the front of the house rather than the barn. Eliza was awake before she fully understood why, some part of her brain that had stayed on watch through her shallow sleep registering the change before the rest of her caught up. She sat up in the chair. The fire had burned down to a solid orange core. Someone had kept it fed through the night. She could see Cody stretched out on the floor 3 feet from the hearth, close enough that she'd have worried about sparks if she wasn't so relieved he was there. Silas was awake in his chair, already looking toward the front of the house. The pounding came again. Fist on wood. Not the storm. A person. "Someone's at the door," she said, which was stating the obvious, but sometimes stating the obvious was how you got your body to move. Silas was already up. She was right behind him. The cold that came through when Silas cracked the front door was a different category of cold than anything they'd felt during the day. A negative thing, an absence so complete it felt like a physical force pushing inward. The lamp in the entryway guttered and nearly died. And in the space of the open doorway, half collapsed against the frame, was Gideon Mercer. He looked like something the storm had chewed on and spat out. His coat was frozen stiff across the shoulders, his hat gone, his face so reddened and raw that for a moment Eliza didn't fully recognize him. Ice had formed in his eyebrows and along his jaw where his breath had caught and frozen. He was gripping the door frame with both hands, and there was a quality to his grip, a locked desperation, that told her he had been holding on to things for a while just to stay upright. "Inside," she said, because Silas and she were both standing there processing what they were seeing, and someone needed to give the first instruction. Silas got an arm around Gideon's back and pulled him through the door, and Eliza pushed it shut against the wind, leaning her full weight against it to get the latch to catch. The sound of the storm cut by half when it finally closed. Gideon made it to the nearest chair and sat down in it heavily, like a man whose legs had been making a decision they hadn't told him about. "Horse," he said. His voice came out wrong, too thick, too slow. "Lost the horse about a mile out. Storm came up faster than—" He stopped. His teeth were chattering so hard he had to pause between phrases. "Walked the last mile. Maybe more. Wasn't sure I—" "Stop talking," Eliza said. Not unkindly. "Don't talk yet." She was already moving. She went to the stove and swung the kettle over the hottest part of the fire, then went to the shelf where she kept the medicinal supplies she'd quietly restocked 3 months ago, because the ranch's previous supply had consisted of 1 bandage roll and a bottle of iodine that was mostly empty. She came back with a blanket, 2 blankets, and wrapped them around Gideon's shoulders, tucking them close. Cody was awake now, sitting up with the blurred expression of someone who'd been dragged out of real sleep, taking in the situation. Within about 4 seconds, he'd assessed it and gotten to his feet without being asked. "What do you need?" he said to Eliza. "Get the others up, quietly. Don't make it a panic. I need someone to go to the kitchen and start heating the beans, and someone needs to get his boots off." "I can do the boots." "Then do it." Gideon looked down at Cody kneeling at his feet, working the frozen laces. He looked around the room, at the sleeping forms against the walls, at the banked fire, at the careful arrangement of supplies and bedrolls, and the rags she'd stuffed in the window frames. He looked like a man walking into a room he'd never seen before, despite having built it. "How long have you all been in here?" he asked. "Since early afternoon," Silas said. He lowered himself into the chair across from Gideon. "Mrs. Rowan called it this morning, had us moved and secured before the worst of it hit." Gideon's eyes found Eliza. She was at the stove, back to him, focused on the kettle. She didn't turn around. "The cattle?" Gideon said. "In the Western Canyon," Silas said. "Her call. All 140 head, sheltered and accounted for before 1 o'clock. A pause. The wind outside made the sound it had been making for hours, that deep grinding pressure that had become the room's constant underscore. "The Western Canyon," Gideon repeated. "She knew about it," Silas said. "Walked it in March. Figured it for a shelter option if a bad one ever came through." Another pause. Eliza poured hot water into a tin cup, added a measure of dried broth she'd been keeping for exactly this kind of emergency. Not because she'd predicted Gideon specifically, but because she'd learned long ago that emergencies always produced at least one hypothermic person, and hot broth was what hypothermic people needed first. She brought the cup to Gideon and held it out. He took it in both hands. His hands were shaking, and the cup was too hot to hold comfortably, but he wrapped his fingers around it anyway, like the heat was something he needed to absorb directly. "Eliza," he said. It was the first time in 8 months that he'd used her given name. She registered it and kept her face neutral. "Drink that slowly," she said. "You start gulping, you'll be sick. Small sips." He drank slowly. Some color began to come back into his face, moving up from the jaw the way warmth always returns. Unevenly, in patches. The body's geography of recovery. Across the room, Pete Dalloway was awake. He'd come up from his bedroll and was sitting against the wall watching Gideon with an expression that was hard to read. Relief, probably, and something else underneath it that Eliza chose not to interpret. "You rode into this," Pete said to Gideon. Not accusing, more like he couldn't quite believe it. "Tried to," Gideon said. He sounded steadier now. The shaking in his hands was slowing. "Saw it building about 10 miles out and thought I could beat it. Couldn't." He looked at the cup in his hands. "Horse spooked bad and threw me. Just gone. Into the dark." He stopped. "Good horse." The room was quiet with that for a moment. "What happened in town?" Silas asked. "What always happens. Took longer than it should. Argued with a man about fence wire for 40 minutes. He almost laughed, though it came out more like a rough exhale. 40 minutes on fence wire? Was it good fence wire, at least?" Cody said from the floor where he was still working on the second boot. Gideon looked down at him. This time the sound he made was something closer to an actual laugh. "Not particularly." The second boot came off, and Cody set it aside and grabbed one of the spare socks Eliza had already placed within reach. She'd thought to pull them from the supply shelf when she'd gotten the blankets. The way she thought of things, one step ahead of the immediate need. Cody looked at the sock, and then at Eliza, and she saw him clock the fact that it was already there, already anticipated. He put the sock on Gideon's foot without saying anything about it. The storm entered one of its cycles around 3 in the morning, not quieting exactly, but shifting into a different gear, the wind dropping from its sustained scream to an irregular series of hard gusts with breathing space between them. It was in one of these spaces that the sound Eliza had heard earlier, the one she and Silas had decided to leave until morning, repeated itself. This time it was clearer, not ambiguous, not structural. A horse, somewhere outside, not far. Gideon heard it too. His head came up sharply. "That's out by the paddock," he said. "We heard something earlier," Eliza said. "Couldn't tell what it was." Gideon was already moving, reaching for his coat, and Silas put out a hand. "You just got in from out there. You're not—" "That's my horse," Gideon said. He said it with a flatness that ended the conversation. Eliza looked at him. At the color that had mostly returned to his face, at the steadiness that was coming back into his movements, and made a calculation. He wasn't recovered, not fully, but he also wasn't the barely standing man who'd come through the door an hour ago. "Not alone," she said. "Mrs. Rowan, you're not going out there alone, Mr. Mercer. You just walked a mile in 4-degree cold, and you've been inside for an hour. She looked at Silas. Both of you. Together. And you come back in 10 minutes whether you find it or not. Silas looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at Eliza. There was a moment where she could see him deciding whether to push back, and she held his gaze with the same flatness she'd used on Pete that morning in the yard. 10 minutes, Gideon said. Rope on the door, she said. There's a coil by the entry. You tie off before you go more than 10 feet. I know how to... Psst. I know you do, she said. Tie off anyway. They went out with a rope tied from the door handle, and the cold came in hard around them before the door swung shut again. Eliza stood in the entryway and listened. Most of the men were awake now, the arrival of Gideon and the subsequent activity having pulled everyone up from sleep. They were quiet, unusually quiet for 8 men in a room, the way people get quiet when they're all listening to the same thing they can't see. 4 minutes passed. 6. Eliza counted them against the sound of the wind. At 8 minutes, the door opened and Silas came through first, and behind him Gideon, and behind Gideon the horse. Gideon's big gray gelding named Arbor that Eliza had seen him ride every day for 8 months, pressing through the entryway with its ears flat and its whole body vibrating with the controlled panic of an animal that had been badly frightened and was now trying to hold itself together. Getting a horse through a house door was not a simple or dignified process. Arbor's shoulder caught the frame, Gideon swore. The horse tried to back up into the storm, and Silas got around behind it and pushed, and for about 45 seconds, it was pure chaos in the entryway. Hooves on the wooden floor, the horse's breath coming in hard white bursts, Gideon talking to it in the low, steady voice that men use with frightened animals. Not quite words, just sound and tone. Then Arbor was inside. Standing in the entryway of the main house with snow still crystallized in his mane, sides heaving, eyes still showing white at the edges, but gradually, settling. Cody started laughing first, not mockingly, just the helpless laughter that comes when tension releases suddenly. Marsh joined him, and then even Delbert, who barely laughed at anything. Never had a horse in the house before, Anders said from his corner, which was the most unexpected sentence he'd produced in 3 months. He can go in the kitchen, Eliza said, which produced another round of laughter, and she let it run for a moment because she could hear in it what it actually was, 8 people exhaling something they'd been carrying all day. Entry hall, Gideon said, still using the voice, still with one hand flat on Arbor's neck. He'll be all right here. Close the inner door. They closed the inner door between the entryway and the main room. Arbor's hooves shifted on the floor planks, restless but no longer panicked. The warmth of the house was working on him the same way it had worked on Gideon. Eliza went back to the stove. The rest of the night was the longest kind. The kind where time gets thick and slow, where an hour can feel like 3, and people stop checking the time because it only makes things worse. Eliza dozed in her chair again, and this time slept harder, maybe 2 hours of actual sleep that sat on her like a weight she didn't want to lift. When she woke at what she guessed was around 5, the fire was still solid. Cody was on the floor nearest it, and Gideon Mercer was sitting in the chair across from her. He was looking at her. Not the way men looked at her in the kitchen, the way that was really just looking past her to see if the food was ready. He was looking at her the way you look at a thing you're trying to fully understand for the first time. She looked back at him, alert the way she always was in the first few seconds of waking, the sleep clearing fast. "How long have you been sitting there?" she said. "A while," he said. "How are your hands?" He looked down at them. "Better." "Feet?" "Cold, but mine." He paused. The sock was a nice touch. She didn't say anything. "Silas told me," Gideon said, "about the day, what you did, the order you did it in." He stopped. "He said you had it planned out, like you'd been thinking about it for a long time." "I'd been thinking about it since March," she said. "Not this storm specifically, just what this ranch would need if the wrong weather came through, what it was exposed to and where the gaps were. You drew a map. A rough one, for Silas to move the herd. Of my land." She met his eyes. "Of your land," she agreed, without apology. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm was different now. Still present, still serious, but the character of it had changed. The sustained pressure had broken into something more intermittent. It wasn't over, but something in it was tiring. "The north pasture fence by the creek," Gideon said. "The posts. 2 of them are gone by now," she said. "Maybe 3. The wood was rotten through. You could see it at ground level if you knew what to look for. And the barn's north wall. The brace was inadequate for a real load. The joint between the beam and the post, it was bearing wrong. I added nails yesterday, but it needs to be properly recut and reset in spring." He stared at her. "What else?" he said. She almost said nothing, almost retreated to the place she'd retreated to all year. The kitchen, the apron, the careful management of what she knew and what she showed. The calculation she'd made every morning since March about how much a woman in her position could say before the men around her stopped hearing it as useful and started hearing it as something to be dismissed or resented. But it was 5 in the morning, and she was tired and her hand hurt, and Gideon Mercer had almost died walking a mile in a blizzard that she had predicted hours before he left. She was done calculating. "The creek in the south pasture floods every spring," she said. "Not badly enough to be a crisis, but enough to compromise about 30 feet of fence annually. You keep repairing it in the same spot, but the problem is the channel, not the fence. The creek has been gradually shifting east over years, and the current repair pattern doesn't account for where it's actually going. You're spending money on a problem that's going to get worse, and calling it maintenance." She paused. "The equipment shed roof has a soft section over the east corner. It's held 2 winters, but it won't hold a third. The bunkhouse needs rechinking on the west wall. The draft in there is significant enough that your men are running their stove hotter than they should to compensate, which means you're burning more wood than you need to be all winter." Another pause. "And your calving area is too exposed. When you lose calves in late winter storms, and I've heard the men say you lose some every year, it's because there's no proper windbreak on the northwest side. 30 feet of timber fence at the right angle would cut that loss by half. Maybe more." She stopped. Gideon was very still. The fire snapped. Somewhere in the entryway, Arbor shifted his weight, and his hooves made a muffled sound on the floor planks. 8 months, Gideon said. 8 months, she confirmed. "Cooking," he said, with a tone she couldn't entirely read. "Cooking," she said, "and paying attention." He looked at her for a long time. She let him look. She was past the point of softening anything, past the point of reading the room and adjusting. She'd said what was true, and she would sit with whatever came from it. "My wife used to say I didn't listen enough," Gideon said finally. He said it in an odd way, not like he was offering personal information, more like he was working something out. "Died thinking I probably still hadn't learned." Eliza said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that. "I've been running this ranch for 11 years, he said. "Same methods, same patterns. Couple of things I changed when I had to, couple of things I never changed because I never thought about them long enough." He rubbed his jaw with the back of his hand. "How much of what you just told me would it have cost me to not know?" "Eventually." She thought about it honestly. "More than you'd want to," she said. He nodded slowly. Pete Dalloway's voice came from across the room, rough with half sleep. "Is it getting quieter, or is that just me?" Everyone in the room who was awake listened. The wind was still there. But the grinding, sustained pressure that had been the night's constant companion had broken up. There were still gusts, still hard ones, but between them now were real gaps, actual silence, the sound of nothing in particular, which, after hours of unrelenting storm, was almost startling in its completeness. "Getting quieter," Silas said from somewhere in the dark. "It'll shift once more before it's done," Eliza said. "Usually gets hard again for about an hour before it breaks. Just push through that." "How do you know that?" Pete asked. The question was completely devoid of hostility. He was genuinely asking. "My father," she said. "He tracked 23 major storms over the course of his life, wrote them down in a journal. I read it enough times that it got into my head." "Your father was a farmer?" Silas said. "Rancher. Wyoming." She looked at the fire. "Lost the ranch the year I turned 18. Bad drought, then a lender who didn't want to wait." She paused. He knew every acre of that land like it was part of his body. Didn't matter in the end, but he knew it. The room was quiet with that for a moment, the way rooms get quiet when someone hands over a piece of themselves they don't usually show. "I'm sorry," Cody said from the floor. His voice was soft. She glanced at him. He was lying on his side, watching her with the open, unguarded expression of someone who was too tired to be anything but genuine. "It was a long time ago," she said, "but thank you." The storm made a liar out of her prediction by being quiet for another 3 hours before its final push came. When it came hard. Maybe the hardest sustained stretch of the whole night. 45 minutes of full-force wind that rattled everything and sent a section of the porch roof loose with a crack like a rifle shot that woke the two men who'd managed to sleep through the quiet stretch. Everyone was awake for that last push. Nobody talked much. They just sat and felt the building take it. The north wall held. The barn held. The western canyon held the cattle in its stone arms through all of it. Clear final moment. It simply became, over the course of 20 minutes, a wind instead of a force, and then a cold morning instead of a siege, and the light that came through the window was pale and thin and real. Actual dawn light, actual day, the world still there on the other side of the glass, white and changed and still. Silas was the first one to the door. He opened it, and the cold that came in this time was just cold, sharp, but the passive kind. The weather of an ordinary Montana November morning, rather than something with malice behind it. The yard outside was buried. The snow had drifted against the barn and the equipment shed in smooth architectural shapes, 4 and 5 feet high in places, and the fence posts along the near pasture were reduced to dark tips just visible above the white. The sky above it was the particular shade of deep blue that only appears after a storm has scoured everything clean. Everyone crowded to the door and looked out. Nobody said anything for a moment. Pete Dalloway was standing just behind Eliza, and she felt rather than saw the way he looked at the scene and then looked at her. "You knew all of this was coming," he said quietly, "yesterday morning, when Gideon drove away." "Yes," she said, "and you just started making extra biscuits." "I made extra biscuits," she said, "and then I went and found Silas." He was quiet for a moment. "I was the one who said you were just the cook." She looked at the white yard, at the untouched snow, at the barn still standing exactly where it should be, with its north wall braced and its doors on their hinges. "I heard you," she said. He absorbed that, didn't try to excuse it. "I was wrong," he said. Simple and flat, the way men like Pete offered the rare things they meant. Without decoration, because decoration would make it smaller. She looked at him. He met her eyes briefly and then looked back at the yard, and neither of them felt the need to do anything else with it. Gideon Mercer came to stand beside her in the doorway, arbor still audible in the entryway behind them, shifting patiently on the floor planks. He looked out at his ranch, at what was still standing, what had been covered, what had held. His jaw worked once. "Let's go see what we've got," he said. The first thing they found was the north fence, 2 posts down, exactly as Eliza had said, and a third leaning at an angle that made it a question of days rather than weeks. The wire had pulled loose from the fallen posts and lay half buried in the snow in long, dark curves, and the gap it left in the fence line was wide enough to drive a wagon through. Gideon stood at the edge of it with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Eliza stood a few feet to his left. She hadn't been invited on the assessment walk exactly. Gideon had said, "Let's go see what we've got," and started walking, and she had walked alongside him, and he hadn't told her not to. Silas was on his other side. The rest of the men had fanned out across the property in pairs, checking structures, digging out where things needed to be dug out, taking stock. "I had Delbert look at those posts in September," Gideon said. "I know," she said. "I saw him. He checked the top section. The rot was at ground level. You have to dig down to see it, couple inches below the surface. Looks solid until you probe it." Gideon looked at the fallen posts. "You probed them." "Pressed on them with my boot. You can feel the give." She paused. "Anyone could have found it. Nobody was looking." He didn't respond to that directly. He just kept looking at the fence with the expression of a man recalculating something he thought he already understood. They moved on to the barn. The north brace had held. Barely, from the look of it. One of the nails she had added had pulled partially out of the beam, leaving a gap you could fit 2 fingers in, and the original cracked joint was more pronounced than it had been the day before, the wood having moved under the storm's load and settled in a slightly worse position. But it had held, The structure was intact. Gideon put his hand on the beam, pressed on it, felt the movement. "This needs to come down and be reset," he said. "Spring," Eliza said, "before you put any heavy load on the loft. I'd pull what's up there now, actually, just to be safe through the rest of winter." He looked at her. "How much is up there?" "About 40 bales. I counted when I moved some things around before the storm." He was quiet for a second. "You moved things around in my barn." "I needed the space near the south wall for the emergency water storage. I stacked the displaced equipment against the east wall. Nothing was damaged." She met his look steadily. "I should have told you I was doing it." "You should have," he agreed. "I will next time," she said. He studied her face for a moment, then looked back at the beam. "Leave the bales where they are. I'll have someone up there reinforcing from the top before I pull the ground brace." He pressed on the beam once more and shook his head slightly. 40 years my father ran this barn. Never had a structural failure." "Your father didn't have the winters you've had the last 5 years, Silas said from behind them. "Climate's been shifting. Bigger loads, longer freezes." Gideon turned and looked at Silas in a way that suggested this was not a new conversation between them. "You've said that before." "I'll keep saying it," Silas said mildly. "Eventually you'll believe me." They came out of the barn into the cold white morning and turned toward the western canyon. The walk took 20 minutes through snow that in places came up to Eliza's knees. She didn't complain about it, and nobody offered to break a different path for her, which was fine. She didn't want a different path. She wanted to be the same as everyone else, trudging through the same snow toward the same destination, and she was. They heard the cattle before they saw them. Low collective sound, the deep irregular chorus of a large herd in motion, filtering up from the canyon as they crested the rise above it. Gideon stopped at the top of the rise and looked down. The canyon was full of cattle. All 140 head moving now that the night was over, their dark shapes against the snow making the canyon floor look like it was breathing. At the back of the canyon, against the curved stone wall that broke the north wind completely, they had clustered overnight into a dense, warm mass, and their collective body heat had kept the ground dry in a 15-foot radius around that back wall. You could see the line clearly in the snow, white everywhere else, bare dark ground where the herd had stood through the storm. It was, objectively, a remarkable thing to look at. Gideon didn't say anything. He just looked at it for a long time, and his jaw moved once in that way it did when he was processing something. "All of them," he said finally. Not a question. "Count if you want," Silas said. "I did it twice last night when I checked. 140. Gideon kept looking. "My father lost 60 head in the blizzard of 1887, he said. "Didn't have a canyon, didn't think to look for one." He paused. 60 head in one night. Nobody said anything to that. The wind off the canyon rim was light now, just a breath, and the sound of the cattle rose up through it like something ordinary and alive, which it was. Eliza looked at the canyon walls, at the geometry of protection she had identified in March, and filed away and waited 8 months to use. She had not known, when she stood in this canyon on that cold spring morning, whether she would ever need the information. She'd had no way of knowing how long she'd stay at Blackstone, no way of knowing if a storm like this would come while she was here to do anything about it. She'd stored it anyway, the way her father had taught her to store everything that might be useful, without knowing when, without knowing if, just because it was true, and true, things were worth keeping. "Let's get them fed," she said. "They've been standing since yesterday noon. They'll need water broken too. Anything that was standing water will be frozen solid." The practical statement broke whatever contemplative mood had settled over the group. Silas turned and started back toward the ranch to organize the feeding. 2 of the hands had already started down into the canyon from the far side. The work of the morning was beginning. Gideon didn't move immediately. He stood at the canyon rim a moment longer, then turned and fell into step beside Eliza on the way back. They walked in silence for a bit. The snow crunched under their boots with the particular sound of very cold, very settled snow, and their breath came in small rhythmic clouds. The sky above was still that deep post-storm blue, impossibly clear, the kind of sky that made the cold feel like it had a purpose. "Tell me about your father's ranch," Gideon said. She looked at him sideways. Why? Because you mentioned it last night and then you stopped. And because what you know, how you know it, it didn't come from thin air. I'd like to understand where it came from. She considered telling him it wasn't relevant, considered redirecting to the list of things still needing to be assessed this morning. She was good at redirecting. She redirected less than she used to. She was working on that. Double bar W, she said. Eastern Wyoming. About 2,000 acres in good years, less when the creek ate the south bank, which it did every 3 or 4 years, like clockwork. She picked her way around a drift. My father ran it alone after my mother died. Just him and me from when I was 12. I was his only ranch hand for most of my teens because we couldn't afford to hire. So you learned everything. I learned everything, she said. Not always well, but thoroughly. Fencing, calving, weather, feed ratios, what a sick cow sounds like versus a cold one, how to read the land when it's trying to tell you something. She paused. When I married Thomas, I stopped using most of it. He had his own operation and his own way of doing things, and he didn't particularly want my input. She said this without bitterness, just as a fact. I got out of the habit of being useful in that way. And when you came here? I started paying attention again. She looked ahead at the ranch buildings coming back into view. It's like a muscle. You use it or you lose it. I used it. Gideon walked beside her for a moment without speaking. A raven crossed overhead, startlingly black against the blue sky, and landed on a fence post ahead of them and looked at them with the evaluating expression ravens always had. The creek problem in the south pasture, Gideon said. You said the channel's been shifting east. About 3 feet east over the last 3 years, from what I can tell by the bank erosion. I could show you the markers I've been tracking. You've been tracking markers on my creek. Mental markers, she said. I don't have a notebook, as Silas pointed out. We'll get you a notebook, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the raven, which had decided they weren't interesting enough and launched itself back into the blue. What would I do with the notebook? She said carefully. Write down what you know about this ranch, he said. All of it. The creek shift, the fence rot, the barn joint, the calving exposure, all of it. Everything you've been carrying around in your head for 8 months. And then what? He stopped walking. She stopped too and turned to face him. He was looking at her with the direct, minimal expression of a man who had decided something and was now saying it without decoration because decoration wasn't his way. I've been running this ranch the same way for 11 years, he said. Some of it good, some of it habit that I called good because I didn't look at it hard enough. He paused. I've got Silas, who knows cattle better than almost anyone in the valley. I've got good hands, mostly. What I don't have is someone who looks at the whole picture, the land, the structures, the patterns, the things that haven't gone wrong yet but will. He held her gaze. You've been doing that job for 8 months without being asked, and without being paid for it, and without anyone knowing. That's... He stopped, looked away for a second, then back. That's not something I can just fold back into the kitchen. Eliza was quiet. The cold pressed around them, and somewhere behind the barn, one of the hands was calling to another, their voices clear and small in the still air. What are you saying exactly? She said. She needed him to be precise. She was not going to assume. I'm saying I want to hire you properly, he said. Not as a cook, as... I don't have a good word for it. Ranch manager is close. Operational foreman is another way to put it. Someone who looks at where this place is going and tells me what it needs before it needs it. He paused. Same wage as Silas, his own scope of work, his own authority within it. You'd have mine. She looked at him for a long time. The men won't like it, she said. Some of them won't, he agreed. Some of them will come around, and some of them aren't going to have a strong opinion because they'll be too busy taking orders from you to form one. She almost smiled at that. Almost. Pete Dalloway. Pete will adjust. He said it with the certainty of a man who had managed people long enough to know which one's bent and which one's broke, and had correctly identified which one Pete was. He respects competence. He just needed to see it. He saw it yesterday. He did. Gideon paused. You want to tell me you need to think about it? I don't need to think about it, she said. I've been thinking about it since March. I just didn't know I was waiting for someone to ask. She paused. I need to know it's real. Not gratitude from last night. Not you almost dying in a blizzard making you generous. Real. He didn't flinch from that. didn't look offended. He took it the way it was intended, as a serious question requiring a serious answer. "When the spring thaw comes," he said, "I'm going to have you redirect that creek channel. I'm going to have you redesign the calving area. I'm going to have you map every structural weakness on this property and build a repair timeline and a budget. If that's gratitude, it's the most expensive kind I've ever offered." He paused. "Does that answer it?" "It does," she said. They stood in the snow for a moment, the deal made in the plainest possible way, and then they started walking again toward the ranch because there was still a great deal of work to do. They found the first news from neighboring properties around mid-morning, when a rider came through from the Hallet, spread 3 miles east. He was a young hand named Tuck, 16 or 17, riding a horse that was already tired from breaking through the drifts, and he had the look of someone who had been awake all night for worse reasons than Blackstone's crew had been. Eliza was in the kitchen, back in the kitchen, by choice this time, because 8 people who had been awake most of the night and were now doing hard physical work in the cold needed feeding, and she was the best person to do that. When she heard the voices in the yard and came to the window to look, Gideon was talking to the boy. She watched his face change as he listened, the particular way it went still and tightened at the same time. He came inside a few minutes later, and she already knew it wasn't good. "Hallett lost about 40 head, he said, "scattered in the night. Some of them will turn up, some won't." He poured himself coffee, held the cup without drinking from it. "The Durance operation lost their equipment shed. Whole structure came down under the snow load. Nobody hurt, but they lost most of what was inside." He paused. "The Picard place lost 2 men." The kitchen went quiet. Eliza set down the pan she was holding. "What happened?" she said. "Went out to check on their herd in the thick of it," Gideon said. "Didn't rope off, got turned around." He stopped. "They found them this morning about a 1/4 mile from their barn." The weight of that settled into the room. She thought about last night, about Gideon wanting to go out alone after Arbor, about her telling him to take Silas and tie off, about the 10 minutes she'd counted against the sound of the wind. "Who were they?" she said. "Older man named Cressfield, one of his nephews." Gideon set down his coffee cup. "I didn't know the nephew. Cressfield I knew 20 years. She didn't say she was sorry because it seemed inadequate, and Gideon wasn't the kind of man who needed to hear it. She just stood with the information for a moment, feeling the full weight of what the night had been. Cody appeared in the kitchen doorway, snow still on his coat from the morning's work, reading the atmosphere immediately. "Bad news from outside?" "Picard lost 2 people, Eliza said. Cody's face went still. He pulled off his hat and held it. Didn't say anything. "Eat something," Eliza said quietly. "You've been out in that cold for 2 hours." He sat down at the table and she put a plate in front of him and he ate without tasting it, the way people eat when they're thinking about something too large for food to address. The news came in throughout the morning, riders from various directions. The storm's report being assembled piece by piece the way disasters accounting always happened, not all at once but in increments, each piece adding to a picture that grew heavier as it grew clearer. Hallett's 40 head, the Durance shed, the Picard deaths. A family called Moorman who'd lost half their chicken operation and most of their winter feed stores. Old Bram Keswick, who ran a small operation by himself 8 miles north, had apparently sat out the storm alone in a structure that lost its roof at 3 in the morning and had kept himself alive by moving into his root cellar with 2 dogs and a blanket. Blackstone received all of these reports, and the arithmetic was stark. The valley had taken a serious blow. Blackstone Ranch had not. Gideon sat at the kitchen table at noon with a cup of coffee and the morning's accumulation of bad news, and Eliza sat across from him because they had things to talk about, and standing seemed wrong for it. "We should send feed to the Moorman place," she said. "They're the most exposed right now. They've got animals that are going to start going down without feed, and they can't get to town until the road is broken." Gideon nodded. "I'll send 2 of the men this afternoon with the sled. Keswick, too. Someone should check on him in person, not just by report." Agreed. She looked at the table, organizing her thoughts. "The Durance equipment. Some of what they lost we can loan. We've got duplicates on a few things that aren't being used until spring." She paused. "And for Hallett, his herd's going to be scattered across 3 properties by now. If we ride the east fence line in the creek corridor, we'll find some of his cattle mixed in with ours when we bring them up from the canyon." "That's going to be a sorting job," Gideon said. "Yes," she agreed, "but it's the right thing and Hallett will remember it." He looked at her across the table. "You're already thinking about what the valley needs." "The valley is what surrounds this ranch," she said. "What happens to your neighbors eventually comes back to you." She paused. "My father understood that. Spent a lot of time helping other people's operations and not enough time on his own. He went too far the other direction." She folded her hands on the table. "But the principle was right, even if the balance was off." He absorbed that. Looked at his coffee cup. "You talk about your father like he was a good man." "He was a good man," she said. "He was also a poor businessman, and he let people take advantage of his good faith, and in the end, that cost him everything he'd built." She paused. "I loved him, and I watched him fail, and I've spent a lot of years trying to understand how those two things existed in the same person." Gideon nodded slowly. It was the nod of someone who understood that kind of complexity personally, not just theoretically. "My father was the opposite," he said. "Excellent businessman. Spent money where it mattered and cut where it didn't. Ranch was in better financial shape the year he died than it was when he started." He paused. "But he worked three hands to quitting over the years because he never once told them they were doing well. Thought it would make them slack." He turned his coffee cup. "They didn't slack, they just left." "Do you do the same thing?" she asked. It was a direct question, and she asked it directly. He considered it honestly. "Sometimes," he said. "I'm aware of it. Don't always manage to correct it." He looked at her. "You probably should know that, if you're going to be working with me." "I do know it," she said. "I've been watching you for 8 months." He almost smiled. "Not quite." "Of course you have." Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway in the same way Cody had earlier, tracking the atmosphere, then deciding the room could absorb his presence. He came in and poured himself coffee and stood with it. "Boys have the cattle up from the canyon," he said, "counting clean now. 138 confirmed, 2 still in the back of the canyon and won't move, but they're on their feet, just being stubborn." "That's all of them," Eliza said. "That's all of them," Silas confirmed. He looked at Gideon. "You want to know what's interesting? When we were bringing them up, we found 4 head mixed in that aren't ours. Brand I didn't recognize." "Hallett's," Eliza said. "His herd scattered east. Some of them must have moved toward the canyon on their own last night. Animals will follow warm air if they can find it." Silas stared at her. "You're saying Hallett's cattle found our canyon?" "The canyon was warmer than the open ground," she said. "They could feel it. Animals aren't stupid." Silas looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at Eliza. There was a moment of shared recognition, the kind that doesn't need words. The realization that the canyon had done more last night than protect Blackstone's investment. It had reached out into the storm and pulled in lost things. "Send word to Hallett," Gideon said. "Tell him we've got 4 of his and he can collect when the road's clear." He paused. "And tell him his cattle have better instincts than some people." Silas laughed at that, a real laugh, short and genuine. "I'll pass it along." He left, and the kitchen was quiet again. The afternoon light came through the window at the low angle of November, thin and golden, the kind of light that exists for maybe 2 hours this time of year before the dark starts claiming it back. It lay across the kitchen table in a long stripe, catching the steam from the coffee cups and the dust motes and the worn grain of the wood. Eliza looked at it. She thought about 8 months of mornings in this kitchen, of breakfasts made and served and cleaned up, while conversations happened around her that she was not part of information gathered in silence and stored in a place that had no shelf, no label, no guarantee of ever being used. She thought about the decision she'd made that morning, the one that had nothing to do with biscuits, and the chain of events it had set in motion, and the way those events had ended here, at this table, with a different kind of conversation than the ones she'd been excluded from all year. She thought about her father standing in his field reading the sky. "Pay attention," he'd said. "The land always tells you first." She had paid attention. For 8 months she had paid attention, and it had built to a moment, and the moment had mattered, and on the other side of it was something she hadn't had in years. A place where her knowledge had a home, a space where being competent was not something she had to apologize for, or hide, or perform carefully so that men didn't feel diminished by it. It wasn't clean. Nothing about it was clean. There were 2 men dead on the Picard spread, and 40 cattle scattered across 3 properties, and a valley that was going to spend the next week accounting for everything the storm had taken. Pete Dalloway had said he was wrong, but that didn't undo the year she'd spent being talked over. Gideon Mercer had offered her a job, but she'd had to almost lose him to a blizzard to get to this table. None of it was the way she would have written it, but here she was. "The notebook," she said. Gideon looked up. "Do you have one?" she said. "Somewhere in this house. Something I can start with." He got up without a word and went to the desk in the corner of the main room and came back with a plain journal, cloth-covered, about 2/3 empty. Set it on the table in front of her, along with a pencil. She picked up the pencil. She thought about where to start. She wrote, "South Pasture Creek, show, channel shift. East Bank erosion markers, November 1893. It was a beginning. Outside, the valley lay under its white coat, quiet and changed, and the work of understanding what had been lost and what it held was only just getting started." The notebook filled faster than Eliza expected. She had thought it would take weeks to get everything down. All the observations she'd been carrying in her head since March, the creek markers and the fence rot and the roof soft spot and the calving exposure and the dozens of smaller things she'd cataloged and filed away in that interior space that had no shelf and no label. But once she started writing, it came out quickly, the way things do when they've been waiting too long for a proper place to land. Within 4 days of the storm, she had covered 30 pages. Gideon read them at night, at the desk in the corner of the main room after supper, and she could tell when he reached something that surprised him because he would stop and go back and read it again, his finger tracing the line, and sometimes he would come into the kitchen the next morning with a question, and they would stand at the counter with their coffee and talk it through. Not the way an employer talks to a hired hand, the way 2 people talk when they are both trying to understand the same problem. It was a new thing, that quality of conversation. She didn't take it for granted. The valley's accounting took the better part of 2 weeks. The Moorman family received feed from 3 neighboring ranches, Blackstone among them, and their animals made it through. Old Bram Keswick was found intact and impressively unconcerned. He told the men Gideon sent to check on him that he'd spent worse nights, which everyone doubted but nobody argued. The Durrance family began rebuilding their equipment shed with lumber contributed from 4 surrounding properties, the kind of practical generosity that frontier communities ran on because they understood that the favor would come back around eventually and the land was too hard and too indifferent to survive it alone. Hallett came personally to collect his 4 cattle. He was a stocky, deliberate man in his 60s with a white beard and a handshake that meant something. And when he came into Gideon's yard and Gideon walked out to meet him, Eliza watched from the kitchen window the way she'd watched things for 8 months. Except now it was different, because she was watching something she was part of, not something happening without her. Gideon brought Hallett inside for coffee, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that he called Eliza out of the kitchen and introduced her by her new role, plain and simple, no qualification, no apology for the unconventional nature of it. "This is Eliza Rowan," he said. "She manages operations here. She's the one who put our herd in the canyon before the storm hit." Hallett looked at her. He had the evaluating eyes of a man who had been doing business for 40 years and could read people efficiently. "Your canyon," he said. My cattle found it in the dark." "Animals know where the warm air is," she said. "I just made sure ours were already there when they arrived." He looked at her for another moment, then laughed, a real one, the kind that comes from genuine surprise, and reached out and shook her hand the way he'd shaken Gideon's, which was to say, as an equal, without condescension, without the slightly softened grip men sometimes gave women as if they were made of something more fragile than bone. "I lost 40 head, he said, sobering. "Yours came through clean." "One cow with a bad leg from slipping on ice," she said. "She'll recover, otherwise clean." He shook his head slowly. "What's different about your setup?" So she told him. Not everything. Not the creek markers or the barn joint or the full contents of the notebook, but the canyon, the logic of it, the method of reading weather signs in combination rather than in isolation. She told him about the horses not eating, about the greenish sky, about the temperature dropping in lurches rather than steadily. She told him what to look for. He listened with his coffee cup in both hands and his white eyebrows slightly raised, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. My grandfather knew how to read weather like that, he said. He was from Vermont originally, said the land talked to you if you paid attention. He turned his cup. I never learned it. Thought it was old country superstition. He paused. 40 head. It's not superstition, she said. It's observation. It's just, you have to want to know what you're looking at. Hallett looked at Gideon. You're keeping her. She's staying as long as she wants to stay, Gideon said, which was not quite the same thing but was, Eliza understood, the more honest version of it. He didn't own her. The distinction mattered. Hallett left with his 4 cattle and a handshake and something else. A look in his eyes when he glanced back over his shoulder at Eliza before he rode out. She recognized it. It was the look of a man filing information away for later. She knew that look. She used it herself. The creek work started in the first week of April, when the ground was soft enough to move but the snowmelt hadn't peaked yet. It was not a glamorous project. Redirecting a creek channel that has been quietly moving itself for years requires digging in cold mud, building up one bank while cutting into another, laying rock and timber in precise locations to guide water that has its own opinions about where it wants to go. It was dirty, slow, physical work, and Eliza was in the middle of it, not directing from dry ground, but in the creek bed herself. Her boots sunk 4 inches in the mud, her back hurting by noon every day, her hands so roughened by that point in the spring that the blisters had stopped forming because there was nothing soft left to blister. Pete Dalloway was her primary partner on the creek project. This had not been her idea. Gideon had made the assignment, and she suspected he had made it deliberately. Not as a test exactly, more as an accelerant for something that had been developing slowly since the morning of the storm. Pete was the best physical worker on the ranch, stronger than Silas and more methodical than Cody, and the creek project needed both of those qualities. He also, it turned out, had a good instinct for water. If we put the second rock deflector here, he said one afternoon, standing in the creek bed with his boots making the same sucking sound in the mud hers were making, the current's going to push against the north bank instead of the south. That's what we want, right? She looked at the water moving around the rock he'd placed, reading its behavior. Move it 6 inches downstream, she said. The way it's sitting now, the current will split and half of it will still be undercutting the south bank. Downstream 6 inches and it catches the full current. He moved it without argument. They watched the water. She was right. The current consolidated against the north bank, clean and predictable. How do you see that? He said. It all looks the same to me. It doesn't all look the same, she said. You just haven't been looking at it long enough. Give it a season. He made a sound that was not quite a grunt and not quite agreement, but lived somewhere between them, and moved to the next section. They worked like that for 3 weeks. Not comfortably exactly, not the easy rhythm of people who have always been on the same side, but productively, functionally. And somewhere in the 3rd week, something shifted. Some residual stiffness between them that had been there since November quietly dissolved in the shared mud and cold water and the daily physical reality of working toward the same thing. He didn't apologize again. He'd apologized once, that morning in the doorway with the white yard behind them, and he was not the kind of man who apologized twice because that would have made it cheaper. Instead, he did something that was worth more. He started asking her questions, real questions, the kind that require actually listening to the answer. About the creek, about the fence planning, about why she'd chosen one approach over another. He didn't always agree with her answers. Sometimes he pushed back, and twice his pushback was correct, which she acknowledged directly, because being right wasn't a competition she was interested in running. One afternoon in the 3rd week, he said, I've been on ranches since I was 16, never worked for a woman before. How is it? She said, moving a rock. He thought about it for a longer moment than she expected. Mostly the same, he said. Few things different. What's different? You explain more, he said. Most bosses just tell you what to do. You tell me why. He picked up a flat rock and fitted it into the bank she was building. Takes some getting used to, but I don't know. You remember it better when you know why. She looked at him. He was fitting the rock into place with the careful attention he brought to physical tasks, not looking at her. That's worth knowing, she said. He shrugged with one shoulder. Just saying. She went back to her section of the bank. The creek moved between them, quieter now, going where they were telling it to go. Cody left in June. She had seen it coming, not with the same certainty as the blizzard, but with the steady accumulation of small signs that a person pays attention to when they've learned to read people the way they read weather. He was restless in the way young men get restless when they've learned what a place has to teach them and the horizon has started pulling. He wasn't unhappy. He wasn't careless. He was just done with this chapter and ready for the next one, and there was nothing wrong with that. He came to her on a Tuesday morning before breakfast and told her he was thinking about heading to Oregon. "What's in Oregon?" she said. "A cousin with a timber operation," he said. "Says he could use a man who can work." He turned his hat in his hands, the same nervous circle she'd noticed the night of the storm. "I'd stay if you think—" "Go," she said. He looked up. "You're not staying for me," she said. "You're thinking about staying because you're afraid it's the wrong time, or I'll need you, or some other reason that's really just you being scared of the next thing." She poured him coffee. "You're not scared of much, Cody. Don't start with this." He was quiet for a moment. "You sure?" "Oregon's a good territory," she said. "Go learn something different." He left on a Thursday with his gear and his horse and his hat that he'd been turning in his hands since November, and he shook hands with everyone and hugged nobody because that was how he was. And when he rode out the gate, Eliza watched from the porch and felt a genuine ache that she didn't try to diminish or dress up as something more useful. She had liked him. He had been good to her at a time when good was not common. That was worth feeling the absence of. She went back inside and got to work. The calving area was rebuilt that August. 30 feet of heavy timber fence on the northwest side, angled specifically to break the wind pattern she had mapped over the previous year, stout posts set deep and braced properly, no shortcuts on the joint work. It took 8 days with all hands. When it was done, Silas walked its length and pressed each post and nodded at the craftsmanship. "You designed this?" he said. "With Pete," she said. "He improved the post spacing. I had them too close." Silas looked at her with an expression she had come to recognize over the months. The one where he was thinking something he was trying to decide whether to say. "Say it," she told him. "I was going to say, I hope you know what you've built here," he said, "not just the fence." He gestured vaguely. At the fence, at the barn behind them, at the creek in the distance running where they'd told it to run. All of it. She looked at the fence. "I know," she said. "Do you?" He said it gently, without challenge. "Because you've been running hard since November. I'm not sure you've stopped moving long enough to look at it straight." She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the fence, at the barn's north wall rebuilt clean and correctly, at the pasture where the South Creek ran obediently in its new channel, at the calving area that would protect animals that would have been lost in past winters without it. She thought about her father's ranch, about what he'd built and what the bank had taken and how it had ended, not because he hadn't worked hard or known his land, but because the things he'd built had only lived in the operation itself, never in anything that could be pointed to as proof of what he understood. The notebook in the ranch house had 90 pages in it now. Whatever happened next, whether she stayed here 10 years or 2, whether Gideon Mercer's fortunes turned or held, whether the valley continued to pull itself together after the storm or slowly frayed back into the isolation that big winters always threatened, that notebook would exist. The creek markers, the weather pattern notes, the structural assessments, the calving wind study she'd done by standing in the pasture at intervals through 3 different storms with a wet finger in the air. All of it, recorded, real, belonging to the land even if it couldn't belong to her in the way that land needed a deed. That was new. That had not existed before November. "I know what I've built," she said to Silas. He nodded and left it there. The first rancher came to ask her advice before winter in October. It was Hallett, which didn't surprise her. He rode up on a cold Wednesday morning with that evaluating look still in his eyes and a list of questions that told her he'd been thinking about their April conversation for 6 months. She answered his questions straight, without performing modesty and without overstating what she knew. She told him what the canyon geometry meant and how to find a similar feature on his own land if one existed. She told him the 5 signs she watched for when a serious storm was building and the order she watched them in. She drew him a rough map of how wind moved through his terrain based on what she could infer from the valley's geography. He sat at the kitchen table and listened with the same focused attention he'd given her in April, and when she was done, he said, "What do I owe you for this?" She looked at him. "Nothing," she said. "The valley's too small for people to be keeping score." He looked at her for a moment. "My grandfather would have liked you," he said. "The one from Vermont?" "Same one." He folded the map she'd drawn and put it in his coat pocket. "He used to say the land doesn't care about your pride. It only cares about your attention." She thought about her father, about standing in a field at 7 years old while a thunderhead climbed the sky. "That's right," she said. "That's exactly right." 2 more ranchers came before the first snow, then 3 from farther out in the valley who had heard about Blackstone's numbers from the previous November. No deaths, no significant livestock loss, structures intact, at a time when every surrounding operation had taken hits. People paid attention to that kind of outcome. In a hard country, results were the only credential that lasted. She did not become known as a legend. She was not celebrated or written about. That was not how things worked in the valley, where people were too practical and too tired to build monuments to the living. What she became was something more useful and more durable. She became someone people called on, the way you called on someone who had proven they would give you a straight answer and not make you feel small for asking the question. Gideon watched this with an expression she had trouble reading for weeks, until she finally asked him directly one evening when they were both at the kitchen table after supper, him with his accounts and her with the notebook. "You have an opinion you're sitting on," she said. "I can tell because you keep starting sentences and stopping them." He looked up from his accounts. "Do I?" "Since Tuesday." He set down his pen. "Hallett mentioned you to 3 other people," he said, "who mentioned you to 3 more, and 2 of those will probably be here by spring with questions." He paused. "I'm trying to figure out what that means for you." "What do you mean?" "I mean," he stopped, tried again. "I hired you to manage this ranch. What you're doing now is bigger than this ranch." He looked at her carefully. "I'm not threatened by that. I want to be clear about that before I say the rest of it. I'm not threatened. I just want to make sure you know that what you know is worth more than what I'm paying you for it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Are you renegotiating my wage?" she said. "I'm telling you that if someone offers you something better suited to what you actually are, you shouldn't stay here out of loyalty." He said it with the difficulty of a man saying something that costs him something. "I benefit from having you here. That's not the same as it being the right place for you permanently." She was quiet for a moment. "Gideon," she said, "I spent a year being invisible, being here, in this kitchen, knowing things nobody asked me about, watching problems build that I could see and no one else seemed to." She paused. "This ranch was the first place in a long time where what I know had somewhere to go, where I could do something with it that mattered." She looked at the notebook. "I'm not leaving because someone 3 valleys over has questions. I'm staying because this is where I started getting to be myself again." She paused once more. "But thank you for saying it." He held her gaze for a moment, then picked up his pen. "I'll raise your wage regardless," he said. "I wasn't going to argue about that," she said, and he almost smiled again in that way he had, almost, not quite, the smile that lived just at the edge of his expression, and sometimes made it out and sometimes didn't. The second winter came. It came hard, the way Montana winters came, without ceremony, without warning, the way the first blizzard had warned. Just a Tuesday in December when the temperature dropped 30 degrees in 6 hours and the snow started and didn't stop for 4 days. But Blackstone Ranch was different now. The barn joint had been rebuilt clean. The South Creek ran where it was supposed to run. The calving fence stood solid on the northwest line. The water barrels were already filled and stored. The firewood was in early. The herd had been assessed, and the ones that needed supplemental feed in cold weather had been flagged and were being watched. The hands knew what to look for because Eliza had spent 3 months teaching them. Not lecturing, just pointing. Look at the horses. Look at the sky. Look at the creek. Look at the things that know before you do and have the honesty to show it. When the 4-day storm ended, Blackstone counted its losses. 3 fence posts in the east pasture, 1 window in the bunkhouse blown out by debris and stuffed with boards before it cost them any real warmth, and 2 calves that had been weakened before winter and had not made it through despite everything. 2 calves. The previous year's comparable storm had cost the valley dozens. Silas came to find her when the count was done, in the pasture where she was checking the east fence damage with Pete, both of them in the snow up to their knees, and he told her the number. She nodded. "Good," she said, and meant it. Not with triumph, just with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had done what was needed, and it had been enough. Pete was driving a temporary post into the frozen ground with a sledgehammer, and he paused and leaned on the handle. "You know what's funny?" he said. "I still think of you as the cook sometimes. Like, my brain goes there automatically." He shook his head. "It's embarrassing." "Don't be embarrassed," she said. I was the cook. That wasn't wrong. It just wasn't all of it." "The two aren't mutually exclusive," Silas said. "No," she agreed. "They never were." She looked out across the white pasture at the fence line they would fix today, and the barn whose north wall was square and sound and would stay that way, at the creek she couldn't see from here but knew was running where it should, at the calving area's new northwest fence standing clean above the snow. She thought about her father standing in his field reading a sky. She thought about Thomas, about the years she'd spent making herself smaller to fit into a life that didn't use what she was. She thought about a morning 8 months after those years ended, when she'd stepped out of a cookhouse in the gray Montana dark and looked at a paddock full of frightened horses and let herself know what she knew. She had not been born into authority. She had not been handed anything. She had simply paid attention, stored what she learned, and at the moment it was needed, refused to be quiet about it. That was it. That was the whole of it. It was not a comfortable story. It was not a clean one. There were men who had died on the Picard place who had not had someone watching the horses that morning, and the unfairness of that sat with her and would for the rest of her life. There was a year of invisibility that had not been required, that had been imposed by nothing more than other people's assumptions, and you couldn't put a pretty frame on that without lying about it. But here she was, standing in the snow, knowing what she knew, doing what she could with it. Pete went back to his sledgehammer. Silas went back toward the barn. The cold air was sharp and clean and smelled of pine from the timber break on the northern ridge, and the sky above was the gray of an ordinary December, not the bruised, catastrophic green of a season ago, just weather, just winter, just the land being what it was. Eliza pulled her coat tighter and walked the fence line. There were 3 more posts to check before dark, and then water barrels to assess, and then supper for 8 people, and tomorrow there would be something else, and the day after something else again. The land always told you first. You just had to want to listen.